Thanks, Craig, and thanks for everyone coming out this afternoon, and Dr. Laffer for making the trip in from Tennessee. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing him, really a man that needs no introduction. Father of side economics, the Laffer curve, economic advisor to President Reagan, and really a Northeast Ohio boy that's happy to be here, coming home, born in Youngstown, went to high school here at University School. So I figure the less time I talk, the more time Art has to talk. So let's welcome Art Laffer to the stage.
Thank you very much, Rich. It's lovely to be home, by the way. It's great, as a matter of fact. Last night I got in. Any of you know the Ritz down here in Public Square? You know that. I went there, and it was sort of interesting because they have this health club. Now, I'm not a health club type of guy, as you can tell by just looking at me, but sometimes the urge and guilt take over. So I went down to the health club this morning there, and I was just pretending to work out on the machines. You know those machines there? I didn't even break into a sweat. I was just sort of standing there just hoping to be observed. And this absolutely gorgeous woman walked in. I mean, just absolutely beautiful beyond belief. And the manager of the health club was standing right next to me, so I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, "Excuse me, but you don't by any chance have any machines that would attract someone like that to someone like me, do you?" And he says, "As a matter of fact, I do." And he walked me right over to the Huntington ATM. Is that all right? What can I tell you? It is really fun to be home. And as some of you know, I was born in Youngstown, raised here in Cleveland, went to Hawken, U.S. Both my parents were born and raised here in Cleveland. My grandparents, all four of my grandparents were born here and raised in Cleveland, Canton, or just the area, Sandyville. 7 out of 8 of my great-grandparents were born and raised here in Cleveland as well, so it really is home for me. And it's just wonderful being back. But I would have moved back here from California, except I don't know if you guys notice you have an income tax here? I moved from California to Tennessee. Now, I hope I'm not going way over your heads on this. But when I was in the governor's council, and when he turned to the dark side, I decided I'd get the hell out of Dodge. And so I moved from there to Nashville, Tennessee. Do any of you know what the income tax is in Tennessee? It's zero. Did I mention it's zero? I mean, come on. It's zero. I paid for my house in Belmead with my first year's tax savings. I would have come here to Ohio, but what is it here in Ohio? It's close to zero, isn't it? Oh, no, excuse me. What's left over is close to zero. I'm sorry. I'm missing that. No, if I'm going over your heads on this, if you have 2 locations, A and B, if they raise taxes in B and they lower them in A, producers and manufacturers and people are going to move from 2. I'm not way over your heads on that one. Is there a reason you think that Ohio has more net out-migration than almost any other state? Your population growth, I mean, it's my hometown, my home state, but the performance. I'm going to start off with you a little bit today on a book I just finished on California. It's called Eureka, which is on how to fix California. But the first half of the book is on states in general. We have 50 states in this wonderful country of ours. They've been operating for 70 years in modern times, pretty much. We not only have all the data of those states, I mean, virtually anything you can imagine a state doing has probably been done many times. And we have all of the evidence from those states. And not only do we have the evidence from all the states, but the IRS collects data on income tax returns. So we know everyone who filed in Alabama last year who's filing in Ohio this year. We can track people by the number of dependents they have, the size of their families, their incomes, the composition of their income. I mean, these data are amazing. We had that from 1989 to the present. If you look at this, and I'm just going to go through it very quickly with you, there's a battle going on in the states of incredible proportions. If you think it's just Romney versus Obama, you're crazy. In the states, you've got a battle going on. You've got states like Ohio, John Kasich, who's done a pretty good job, I think. I don't know what you guys think, but he got pushed back a little bit in the ballot propositions here. But then you have other states like Indiana. Mitch Daniels, have you seen what the first thing Mitch Daniels did when he came into office? First thing he did was he obviated the executive order by Evan Bayh to allow collective bargaining. He got rid of collective bargaining, put in the right to work in Indiana, got rid of the estate tax in Indiana. Mike Pence is going to replace him. Mike Pence is right in line there. If you look at Oklahoma, Sam Brownback has done huge tax cuts in Oklahoma. Missouri, in Missouri, they've outlawed any city from having an income tax other than Kansas City and St. Louis, which currently have them. But the proposition also required Kansas City and St. Louis to have an election every 5 years to re-up the income tax in the city. So it's pretty impressive what's going on there. If you look at Oklahoma, you have a huge change coming there with Mary Fallin. I could take you to Tennessee. In Tennessee, we got rid of our gift and estate tax. We're going to get rid of our hall tax as well. We got rid of collective bargaining in Tennessee as well. In New Hampshire, they voted to get the right to work bill in there. The governor, Lynch, vetoed it, but the election, well, I guess we're going to probably get another Democratic governor there in New Hampshire, but they're going to keep trying. You compare these states. I mean, look at Florida as another one. Texas with Rick Perry, what's going on there. That's on the one side. On the other side, if you see Vermont, if you see what's going on with O'Malley in Maryland, and you've probably seen him on TV recently. If you look at what's going on in Connecticut, also in the opposite direction. Minnesota with Mark Dayton, the governor there. If you look at Illinois with Quinn, have you followed what's going on with Quinn and the tax increases and then all the exemptions and what's going on there? California is probably the most exciting one of all. Governor Brown has proposed a tax initiative in California which would raise the highest marginal rate by 3 percentage points from 10.3 to 13.3% income tax at $1 million and up. The increases start at $250,000, and he's also got a 25 basis point increase in the sales tax. What's really sort of cool about California, they always have their own little twist to it. They made it retroactive to the beginning of this year. You know, that's what's called fairness. Just teasing. But these battles are going on. Let me just take you through a couple of things in states, just sort of fun. And just to give you a flavor. What I did, the first thing, there are 9 states in the United States that have no income tax. Okay, Nevada, Washington State, Alaska, Wyoming, South Dakota, New Hampshire, and then the 3, Texas, Tennessee, and Florida, are the 9 states. If you look at those 9 states over the past 10 years and their performance versus the nation as a whole and versus those 9 states that have the highest income tax rates, it's really astounding, the differences in growth rates. For the 9 states that have no income tax, their growth in gross state product over the last decade was 58.5%. For the nation as a whole, 46.6%. For the 9 states with the highest income tax rates, 42.1%. Ohio, by the way, was very lucky to be included in one of those states with the highest income tax rates. Ohio's performance has been really dismal over the last decade, as you all know. You know, also in there, I've got all the other metrics you can think of, but what I did as well is not only looked at those, and I could take you population growth as the same thing. I could take you through any of the other metrics, jobs, or any of that. What I also did was I took that number back 50 years. Maybe this is just a fluke this last decade, just unusual. I went back 50 years with those states that have no income tax. Now, as you get back in time, a few states start coming into the fold of no income states. Those were states that have adopted a progressive income tax in the last 50 years. So I kept it even on both on the top and the bottom. There's not one year in the last 50 that the states with no income tax did not outperform those states with the highest income tax rates or the nation. Back in the 70s, the gap was much larger than it is today. It's incredible. Now, you may ask me, you know, the highest income tax states and the zero income tax states just have nothing in common. you're comparing apples and oranges. I mean, here you've got Nevada with its gambling. Here you've got Wyoming with its severance tax, Texas with its oil, Alaska with its oil. I mean, you've got all of that. So what I did just to sort of minimize that complaint is there are 11 states in the United States that have introduced a progressive income tax in the last 50 years. They include Maine, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, 1972, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, West Virginia. If you look at those 11 states that have introduced an income tax, now remember, we all have the same number of states, so there's nothing changed in the denominator. If you look at those 11 states, each and every one of those 11 states has declined as a share of the U.S. economy from before they put in the income tax to today. I took the 5 years before and looked at their share of the U.S. economy and looked at it now, and each and every one of those states has declined. Some of them have declined by a lot. Ohio, Michigan. I mean, I just went up today to see my family up at Lakeview Cemetery, and we drove around Cleveland a little. It's amazingly different than it was in the 50s and 60s. I mean, Ohio was one of the lowest unemployment rate states in the nation, one of the fastest growing. We have more of the Fortune 500 headquartered here in Ohio than anywhere. Now look at it, you go downtown. The only places that are prospering are tax-exempt organizations and government. If you go to Detroit, I mean, let me just take you through Michigan. Michigan, before it introduced its income tax, the progressive income tax, was 5.2% of the U.S. economy. Today, Michigan is 2.7% of the U.S. economy. That's a collapse, people. If you go through Detroit, drive around it, it's hollowed out. Let me give you one example. I mean, I told you each of these. There are some states that are so poor that a progressive income tax can't hurt them. Yes, it can. West Virginia's always been the end of the highway. It's always been the dirt road. And they put in a progressive income tax. They're even smaller now than they were. I mean, how do you make those people even worse off? They don't have many teeth left to lose. Just joking, just joking. I mean, it's amazing. In 1965, New Jersey, you know, the wonderful state of New Jersey. New Jersey had neither an income tax nor a sales tax, neither one. Okay, did not have an income tax or a sales tax. It was one of the fastest growing states in the nation. People were moving into New Jersey by droves, and it had a balanced budget. In fact, it was running a surplus. A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, with my student as the governor of New Jersey, John Corzine, before Chris Christie. He was, but by the way, I just want a little truth in here, is that he was a C student. And now, given what's happened to MF Global, I'm not sure he even earned the C. But back there, when John Corzine was governor, had one of the highest property taxes in the nation, one of the highest sales taxes in the nation, one of the highest income taxes in the nation, one of the slowest growing states in the nation. People were leaving in droves like rat leaving a ship, and it was running huge budget deficits. How do they do that? If you look at all these other numbers of migration, it just fits a pattern. Economics really works. You guys have here in Ohio, I think it's 1,400 individual income tax jurisdictions in the state. What's going on? I mean, these are the real problems here in the country. I'm not going to stay with the state stuff any longer, but it really does. Let me tell you, you cannot tax an economy into prosperity. Did I say that? If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work, do I need to say the next sentence to you? Don't be surprised if you find a lot of people not working. If you tax rich people and give the money to poor people, you're going to have lots and lots of poor people and no rich people. You know, have you ever heard of a poor person spending himself into wealth? It doesn't. Econ 1, it's really straightforward. People respond to incentives. Everything responds to incentives. You move the mice, and they go right back to the cheese. But you move the cheese, you move the mice. Incentives really work. I want to talk to you about some of the ones in the political level, on the national level. I wanted to touch on the states because you guys are closer to my heart than any place on earth. There's no place I'd rather live than be here in Cleveland, to be honest with you. I just can't. It's so unfriendly to the views that I espouse. I want to talk to you on a federal level. While the states have had this political bifurcation of extreme proportions, the federal government has too. In 2008, if you'll remember, John McCain and Barack Obama both took a day off from campaigning to go back to Washington to vote in favor of TARP. They both voted for it. In 2008, 2007, 2008, George W. Bush put a stimulus add-on in the Farm Bill, put a stimulus add-on in the Housing Bill. He put on TARP, that's $700 billion right there. He did the $600 per capita tax rebate. You remember that one? That was all W in the Congress there. They nationalized Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. You know, all of that was bipartisan ignorance as far as I'm concerned. Today, there are no overlaps. There's not one Republican today who would vote for stimulus spending. There's not one Democrat today who would vote for stimulus spending. The issues have become clean, clear-cut, bi-party line, which to my way of thinking is exactly the way it should be. You know, I dislike it when politicians compromise so that the voters don't have a choice. I love it when you get a clear choice in an election. If you know the two views of stimulus, but let me, if I can, go through them with you, because they're both really important. If you listen to Krugman or Larry Summers or any of the others, you'll know that stimulus spending really helps an economy. If you talk to me or go and do your Ouija board and talk to Milton Friedman, you'll get a different answer. By the way, I did always love it when I was at Chicago. You know, at Chicago, following Milton Friedman to the podium, I could actually raise the microphone. It was fun. Now, I still could do that whenever I debate Robert Reich. I can raise the microphone after him, too, but the only difference between Friedman and Reich is I actually looked up to Milton Friedman. Let me, if I can take you through the Keynes, and I'm going to take you through this issue very quickly. Stimulus spending. The whole logic is if the government gives, let's say, $600 per capita tax rebate, I'm going to use Larry Summers' thing there. If a guy gets a check for $600 that the other would not have had, he's going to spend more than he otherwise would have spent. That's the marginal propensity to consume. You with me on that? You remember your macroeconomics. And that, in turn, will create jobs, output, employment for the people who now are going to supply him with the goods and services that he otherwise would not have purchased had he not had that $600 check. You follow me? Those people then will have higher incomes than they otherwise would have had, and they'll spend more, and there'll be this cascading effect through the economy. I'm going to be a little geeky with you here. The total increase in output, this thing just cascades through. The total increase in output from the stimulus check is, of course, the multiplier. And if you want to calculate it, it's 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. That's all. You all remember the model? And that's the whole logic. You can go see Romer and Bernstein's paper in January 2009 if you want to see it. And they go through and estimate all the multipliers, what they would be, and take the average of all of them. They take the $862 billion stimulus package of Barack Obama's. They multiply the two. They get the increase in output. They then spread it over different quarters, sort of nicely spread it over. Then they use Okun's law to translate out of it. They translate the increase in GDP into an increase in employment or drop in the unemployment rate. And if you'll remember, Bernstein and Romer had the paper where they showed the unemployment rate without the stimulus, the unemployment rate with the stimulus. You remember all that? You know, it was very well laid out. It was correct. And by the way, it's the way economists should do their work. They should spell it out very clearly so you can check exactly what did or did not happen. As far as their logic goes, they're perfectly correct. If you do give a guy a check for $600 that he otherwise wouldn't have had, it's very true that that guy will spend more than he otherwise would have spent. That's correct. He will employ people who otherwise would not have been employed, supplying him with the goods and services that he otherwise would not have bought had he not had that $600 check. You with me? And they'll have more. All of that's true, but it's only part of the truth. That's chapter 1 of a 3-chapter book. The second chapter starts off by saying that the tooth fairy no longer works on the Treasury staff. Unfortunately, in this wonderful world of ours, government does not create resources, it redistributes resources. For every resource it gives to a transfer recipient, there's a transfer payer who loses those resources. If you want to go back to your economics and you look at the Slutsky equation, let me tell you that the income effects of a stimulus package in an economy always sum to 0. For every transfer recipient who's stimulated, there is a transfer payer who is destimulated. That person buys less than he or she otherwise would have purchased had they not have the transfer resources taken from them. That in turn will cause goods and services that had been produced to no longer be produced. Those people will have lower incomes than they otherwise would have had. They'll spend less, and there'll be a cascading effect in the exact opposite direction that will precisely offset the stimulus recipient's stimulus. Are all of you with me in this? There is no stimulus in stimulus spending. If the economy has 100 apples, if you give 20 of those apples to people based upon some characteristic other than work effort, well, they're better off. The people from whom you've taken the apples are worse off, period. This was brought into economics by Leon Valra, into English by John Hicks, Lord Hicks, in a book called Value and Capital. Go back and read it if you ever want to get your economics again. You know, the third chapter of this book is really a little ugly. While the income effects always sum to zero in an economy, they always do, the substitution effects don't. The person you give the transfer or stimulus funds to, that person has found an alternative way other than working for getting resources. The person from whom you take those resources finds that he or she gets less for working than they otherwise would have gotten, and so both of those people are incentivized to work less. I had the worst time explaining this to Senator Nelson from Wisconsin. I was testifying in Jerry Ford's tax rebate back in 1974. I was with Otto Eckstein, Paul McCracken, and Gardner Ackley. The four of us were on the podium, and I was trying to explain the substitution effects, and I just couldn't get the words right. So finally, I just in frustration, I said, Senator, if these other three economists are correct, that this tax rebate will stimulate the economy and lead to higher output, what the heck's wrong with you? Why only $600? Don't you love our country? Come on, let's do 1,000, let's do 6,000, let's do 60,000, let's do 100,000, let's do 1,000,000, let's do 100% of GDP. So everyone who doesn't work and doesn't produce receives everything, and all those who do work and do produce receive nothing. Senator, what do you honestly think would happen to output in this country? Of course, the answer goes to zero. I'm going to try it one last way with you to explain why stimulus spending not only doesn't help the economy, why it hurts the economy. The reason we have the Great Recession is not in spite of stimulus spending, it is because of stimulus spending. My colleague, Milton Friedman, always said, government spending is taxation, period. The government gets those resources from other people. That's the end of the question. To see this, if it's good economics, it's scalable. Good economics should work just as well in a 315 million person world as it does in a 50-person world as it does in a 2-person world. Good economics is scalable. Now, the reason you have such a hard time with the 315 million person world is it's impossible to follow the T accounts. You just can't do it. You've got Chinese capital flows, credit default swaps, multipliers, velocity. I'm so confused I can't figure out where the heck I am. But in a 2-person world, you can actually understand what's going on. Let me try it this way with you. If you have 2 people, that's it. Farmer A and Farmer B, that's the whole world. There's nothing else but those 2 people. You follow me? If Farmer B gets unemployment benefits, who do you think pays for them? Am I going way over your heads on this one? Government spending is taxation. There is no stimulus in stimulus spending. And that is the reason why we have the Great Recession today, and it's not in spite of that. If you look at any of my work, I don't know if any of you have seen my Wall Street Journal pieces where I look at what happened in the last 2 years of W, where W increased stimulus spending dramatically, and it was those periods just by the exact that the economy collapsed in the deepest recession. If you look at Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton came into office, in the 8 years he was in office, he cut government spending by more than the next 4 best presidents in U.S. history combined. And we had the greatest boom you've ever seen. You can understand why I voted for Clinton twice. And by the way, it wasn't because of his personal character. Well, in fact, my view was I didn't think he was a very honorable person, to be honest with you. And God knows I would not want my daughter to intern in that White House. But my view was on voting for him is I figured that even if he weren't elected president, he still would have been a sketchy person. But we have lost all the benefits of him as a great president. So I voted for him. But if you look at what happens, I took the OECD, 34 countries in the OECD. I ranked them all by the amount of stimulus spending relative to the size of their economy. Those countries in the OECD that had the greatest stimulus spending had the biggest declines in output. Those that had the smallest increases in spending had the least declines in output. 2007, 2009, changes in growth rates. That's what I did. If you look at 1944 to 1946, 47, 48, government spending as a share of GDP went from 48% of GDP down to 17% of GDP in 1946. What do you think happened to private output and employment and production in this country? Kapow, through the ceiling. You know, stimulus spending doesn't stimulate. Well, that's a battleground area. The last one I'm going to touch on with you for just a second, tax rates. You know, when I went to tell John McCain in 2007 when he was going to run in the primary. I've known John forever. I did his first fundraiser in Arizona in the primary, Republican primary, when he was running for the House. My godfather, Justin Dart, was his campaign chairman. I love the guy. He used to stay at our home in California. He's just a wonderful, wonderful American hero. And in spite of whatever policies he espoused, I was going to support him because I really like him personally. So I went to have breakfast with him in the Senate dining room early, just the two of us. And before I could even get a word out to tell him I was going to unconditionally support him, he said, "Now listen, Laffer, you're wrong on those damn tax rates. We got to raise taxes on the rich." You know, back then, it was pretty much bipartisan on raising tax rates on the rich. That it's not any longer, people. There's not one Republican today that would vote for raising tax rates on the rich. There's not one Democrat who wouldn't. You've again got this breach here, which is wonderful. On unions, there's no difference. I mean, there weren't differences before. My dad was a great supporter of a union shop here. And Jack, you remember my Jack Breen here. My dad just loved Jack Breen more than life itself long ago, except for me. He loved me better than you. But, I mean, my dad supported forced union shops. You know, that was a view back then of Republicans and Democrats. Today, there's not one Republican who does. There's not one Democrat who doesn't. If you look at all these other issues. But today on taxes, let me take you through this a little bit. The highest marginal income tax rate. In 1913, we put in the progressive income tax in the United States. Woodrow Wilson. Cordell Hull, if any of you remember, from Tennessee. He did it for the nation, but he wouldn't do it for Tennessee. Thank God. By the way, did I mention Tennessee has no income tax? I just thought I'd mention that to you. I mean, no income tax. He raised the highest tax rate from 0% in 1913 to 7%. Now, I'm going to stipulate today, just so you know I'm fair and balanced, I'm going to stipulate today that when they raised the highest tax rate from 0% to 7% on the rich, they did collect more revenue. I won't duck that one. By 1919, they'd popped that highest rate from 7% to 77%. 6 years. The election in 1920 was all about the highest tax rates in the U.S. It was our governor, Governor Cox, who was Woodrow Wilson's handpicked candidate, if any of you remember. Cox chose his best friend, who was governor of the state of New York, a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as his running mate. The race in 1920 was all about taxes. It was Cox and Roosevelt versus Harding and Coolidge. And Harding and Coolidge had a slogan of a return to normalcy, which meant cutting tax rates back to their pre-World War I levels. Harding and Coolidge won by the largest percentage ever. I mean, they just swamped it. They cut the highest marginal income tax rate in the United States from 77% to 25%. Is that a good enough cut for you? They lowered the highest tax rate on the rich from 77% to 25%, less than a third of what it was before. Tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners as a share of GDP, through the ceiling. Tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went way up as a share of GDP. We had a period there called the Roaring '20s. We had a big boom, and tax revenues from the rich went up as a share of GDP. Then we had a period with another Republican coming in, a guy named Herbert Hoover. He signed into law in May of 1930 the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the biggest tax increase in traded products. The economy spinning south, ba-ba-ba-boom. To respond to this collapsing U.S. economy, Herbert Hoover knew the government was running short of revenues. So what did he do? In 1931, he passed a tax bill, which on January 1st, 1932, raised the highest marginal income tax rate in America from 25% to 63%. That a good enough increase for you? We also increased excise tax, the gift tax, the estate, all the, I mean, there wasn't a tax that they didn't raise. Roosevelt obviously won the election. The first thing he did was had the Bank Holiday Act of March of 1933. But then Roosevelt wasn't getting the monies he thought he needed. So in 1935, he passed a bill that took effect on January 1st, 1936, which raised the highest marginal income tax rate from 63% to 79%, wiggling its way all the way back up to 83% before the war. Okay, he raised the estate tax to 90%. He had a 25% per annum retained earnings tax on businesses. That's really good for stock prices, let me tell you. Question, what happened to the highest margin, what happened to the tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners during the Great Depression, during that whole period, as a share of GDP? They went down. They did. What happened to the economy during that period? It's called the Great Depression, people. Jack Kennedy comes into office. 1961, cuts the highest marginal income tax rate from 91% to 70%. Cuts the lowest rate from 20 to 14%, puts in the investment tax credit, accelerated depreciation, cuts the corporate rate from 52 to 48%. He tried to cut it to 46%, but thank God Barry Goldwater and the Republicans blocked him from that irresponsible move. What was the period called? It was called the Go-Go 60s. Do any of you remember it? It was a real boom. What happened to tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners? Through the ceiling, and they really did go up. Then we had a period called the Four Stooges. I call the Four Stooges. Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. To my way of thinking, it's the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. What happened to tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners during that 16 years? Down as a share of GDP. So you remember what happened to the stock market? The stock market in February of 66 went from 1,000 to 777 in August 82. That's 16 and a half years. But that's not adjusting for inflation. If you adjust it for inflation, the stock market went from 1,066 to 235 in 1982. Is that a bare enough market for you? And then, of course, excuse me, do you have any water in it? No, just teasing. Ronnie was nominated. You don't mind me talking a little bit about the real president, do you? The clouds open. I understand there are only 16 days in Cleveland that are sunny. I told the person who told me that that's a huge increase in the number of sunny days. Some of the steel mills must be closed. But, you know, the cloudy skies, when Reagan was nominated, the clouds opened. The sun shone forth in the earth. The fields, they turned green. The animals frolicked and multiplied. The trees blossomed and came into fruit. The children danced in the streets. And taxes were cut. I mean, there's not a tax. You cut the highest tax rate from 70% to 28%. You know, you could go through all of them. I won't do the whole litany with you. 1980, the top 1% of income earners. They paid 17.5% of all the income taxes collected in the U.S. in that year. 2007, after a long period, and I told you I voted for Clinton twice. I thought he was great. I thought the Bushes were probably the worst things that ever happened. But in that whole long period there, this pattern persisted. In 1980, the top 1% paid 17.5% of all the income taxes. Or if you look at it as a share of GDP, which is the proper way of looking at it, they paid 1.5% of GDP in income tax. In other words, you take the total taxes collected from the top 1%, divided by GDP, it comes out to 1.5% of GDP. You with me? 2007, the top 1% of income earners paid 42.5% of all the income taxes collected in that year. And their taxes as a share of GDP were 3.2% of GDP, more than double what it was at much lower tax rates in 1980. You know, it shouldn't surprise you that raising tax rates on rich people loses you money and loses you good economics too. I mean, rich people don't like to pay taxes. Now, poor people don't either, nor do middle-income people like to pay taxes. But rich people can do something about it. They have the means to hire lawyers, to hire accountants, to hire deferred income specialists. They have the means to hire congressmen and senators. When you see a group of people hanging with the president, don't for a moment think that this is a group of street people trying to explain to the president what it's like living in poverty. No, this is a group of people trying to get a favor from the president. That's what they do. That's how the system works. Not only do rich people have the means to do this, they have the ways to do it. Rich people can change the location of their income. I moved from California to Nashville, Tennessee, purely and simply because of taxes. Did I mention that Tennessee has no income tax? Did I? I mean, that's it. Rich people can do offshore funds and other people can't. They don't have the ability to. Rich people can change the timing of their income. They can do IRAs, KEOs, 401ks, all sorts of things they can do. Rich people could change the volume of their income. Poor people and middle income people can't. Rich people can also change the composition of their income. And I'm going to talk to you about one of the president's greatest allies, a Frenchman from Omaha, a guy named Warren Buffett. I've got to go through this with you because the hypocrisy knows no bounds. He wrote a letter to the New York Times that he paid less in taxes than anyone in his office. You remember that? And me and my friends have been sitting around here, and we all agree we should pay more in taxes. That's what he said to the president. And if you look at his letter said that he paid a little less than $7 million in income taxes that year. You go back and get it, $6,983,000, something like that. I'm going to say it's $7 million he paid in taxes. And he said his average tax rate was 17.4%. Now, hold back, people, because I am a math whiz. I took $7 million and divided it by 0.174, and I got his taxable income of that year as being around $40 million, a little bit less. Now, that sounds like a lot of money to people, and it is. But I went to Forbes that year, and I checked his net wealth. And from 2009 to end of 2010, his net wealth went up by about $10 billion in unrealized capital gains. Not only did his wealth go up by $10 billion in that year, but he also gave about $1.75 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was tax deductible, not even in his tax return, not in his wealth either. And he gave a bunch to his sons and daughter to their foundations as well. If you look at the Simon definition of income, which is your spending plus the increase in your wealth plus what you give away, Warren Buffett that year had an income of over $12 billion, and he paid $7 million in taxes. That comes out to an average tax rate of 0.06%. How did he get away with that? Because we don't tax unrealized capital gains. There are all sorts of deductions to charitable contributions, 501c3s, all of this sort of stuff. That's what happens. Wealthy people can choose the composition of their income, as well as the location, the timing, and the volume. That's why they are so sensitive. My view is that if you raise tax rates on the rich, given the current tax codes, you're not going to get the money and you will cause a bad economy. That's the way I see it. It's a very different view from the other people. Now, what you want to do when you look at tax codes is it's really straightforward. There are 5 things you got to do to have a healthy economy. 5 things. And it's not, as Larry Gatlin says, it is not rocket surgery. Okay? Number 1, you need a low-rate flat tax, like Jerry Brown's of California when he did the 13% flat tax, exempting nothing. Number 2, you need spending restraint. Poor people can't spend themselves into wealth. It just doesn't happen. Government spending is taxation. You need spending restraint. Number 3, you need sound money. You got to have sound money. Nothing will bring an economy to its knees quicker than a weak currency, high inflation, high interest rates. Nothing will. You need free trade. There are some things we produce better than foreigners, and there's some things foreigners produce better than we do. We and they would be foolish in the extreme if we didn't sell them those things we make better than they do in exchange for those things they make better than we do. It's a win-win. And lastly, regulations. Everyone knows we need regulations. Everyone does. No one disputes that. You can't wake up in the morning and decide which side of the street you're going to drive on today. That makes no sense. But what you do want is you want to make sure that those regulations are to a specific purpose at hand and don't extend beyond that purpose and do collateral damages in areas where you had no idea. Low rate flat tax, spending restraint, sound money, free trade, and regulatory reform. If you do that, what you need to do then is step back and let the markets take care of themselves. And with that, I'm going to throw it open for any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Laffer. Informative and entertaining as always. Now, if anyone does have any questions, I believe there'll be some people circulating through the crowd with some microphones, and let's have at it.
Go ahead. Just.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming, Dr. Laffer.
My pleasure.
I wanted to know, I wanted to get your impressions on how you think, two things. How should Romney and Ryan handle charges that they don't care about these 47% that don't pay federal income taxes? And do you really think a President Obama, given the economic advisors he does have, or excuse me, a President Romney, will repeal Obamacare, given Hubbard and the other folks he has on his staff?
I want to do a little thing here. I have not consulted with Romney. Ryan I know really well. I've known him forever since he was staffer on Jack Kemp's staff. But I'm not working with the other campaign. And, you know, once you've had, there's nothing better once you've had the best. And ever since Reagan, I've never worked with any president again, seriously. So Romney has said many, many times he'd repeal Obamacare. I take him at his word that he would. I don't know what their views are on the 47%, but I do know that's an incorrect number. The 47% may not pay income taxes, but they pay a lot of taxes. And let me tell you what they pay that's even worse is they pay in unemployment, they pay in poverty, they pay in despair, they pay in losing all their dignity. You know, no one feels good about getting a handout. No one does. If you think getting a handout is a way of life, you're a very different person than I am. I personally believe in Jack Kennedy when he said that the best form of welfare is still a good, high-paying job. There is no alternative economic growth. Or Benjamin Hooks, if any of you remember Benjamin Hooks, he said the blacks are hired last and fired first. The only way we're ever going to get jobs and keep them is there's so damn many jobs around, they have to hire us. You know, the growth model is espoused by both Ryan and Romney. I have no idea whether they're going to implement it correctly or not, but they have espoused both things you've said, repealing Obamacare and economic growth. And whether they like the 47% or not really doesn't matter. It's whether they'll do something to make those people prosperous. And that's the dream. The dream has never, ever been, people, to make the rich poor. The dream has always been to make the poor rich. You want to pull the bottom up, not pull the top down. You really don't. You know, when you go after the top 1% of income earners, who do you think does all the jobs? Who do you think does the investment decisions? You can't love jobs and hate job creators. You just can't. Well, next one.
Dr. Laffer, thank you for being here today. In your farmer A versus B model, if you allow for borrowing and if you allow for lags between the transactions, how does that impact the situation?
It doesn't. I'll go back to Leon Valra if I can. His example was apples. He said if the price of apples rises, it is true that apple growers will be wealthier, they'll have higher income, and they will spend more. That's true. But it's equally as true. If the price of apples rises, apple consumers will be poorer, they'll have lower incomes, and they will spend less. These two effects will offset each other by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the month, by the year, to the 9,875th decimal place. It's called double entry accounting. Double entry economics. It was brought into economics in the 13th century in Italy. And in fact, it was Fibonacci who was the guy who did the double entry from the Arabic. If you look at it, it's the second entry of the same transaction. Taking the apple from the guy who's the transfer payer and giving that apple to the transfer recipient is one transaction. They both happen at the same time. And given that the incidence of the tax and the burden are so different, you really don't even know who it is who's paying the tax or who's getting the benefit. You really don't. When you use a general equilibrium solution, you really can't tell where they come from. So I hope that answers your question properly.
Arthur, welcome back home.
Thank you.
You say you're not working closely with Romney as you did with Reagan, but hopefully you can address this issue. There are a number of us who are strongly for Romney, but are worried about one thing, and that is he talks about increased defense spending, cutting taxes, not fussing with Medicare, and he's going to balance the budget and address the deficit, which is $16 trillion heading higher further up. There are a number of analysts, not Democratic, but a number of analyses who say the numbers don't add up. Yeah. And there's a worry that in the coming debates, he might get charged with voodoo economics, things like that.
That was what they charged me with.
I know.
But you know what voodoo is, by the way. I can't use that joke. Well, I'll use it anyway. They're not recording this one, are they? Voodoo, do any of you know what the definition of voodoo is? It's the past perfect of VD. No, let me give you a serious answer to your question. I'm not going to do it all, but he talks about the $5 trillion tax cut that goes to the middle class. You know that. Now, from what I understand, this tax rate reduction would lead to something like that. It comes out almost exactly to equal tax-mageddon. As you know, on January 1st, 2013, there's a huge tax increase coming in the U.S. It's not only the Bush-era tax cuts that are not going to be extended. You've got all the Obamacare tax increases, which are coming in, and then you've got a lot of ducks, pigs, chickens, and geese and stuff else in there, like the 2% payroll tax cut that wasn't with either one of them. You've got the 100% expensing of capital equipment. If you take all of those numbers together in a static analysis, and believe me, the world won't be static, but if you did it statically, it comes out to about $497 billion. Which is almost $500 billion, and of course the way they do taxes now is they do it over a 10-year period. So if you get $500 billion over 10 years, that's the $5 trillion tax cut that I think Obama is talking about. What Romney has said time and time again is that while he is cutting tax rates, that's really true. He's going to be expanding the tax base by eliminating deductions, exemptions, and exclusions. Things like mortgage interest. I don't know which ones they've talked about. State and local taxes, deductibility, mortgage interest, maybe unrealized capital gains might even come into there with something there. There are a lot of tax credits, all of these things. So by expanding the base, you can lower the rates and have it static, revenue neutral. You follow me? That's what I believe Romney and Ryan are talking about. That's what they've said 100 times on that. It's very much like the Tax Act of 1986, which was my favorite baby. That was my baby. I love that one. Let me give you the Tax Act of 1986 just so you can get a flavor. And you can get a flavor of what will happen to partisanship, too. In 1986, the highest marginal income tax rate was cut from 50% to 28%. Now, let me say it again. From 50% to 28%. Is that a good enough handout to the super rich and wealthy? I mean, we just poured rich cream, not even this is heavy whipping cream right down their gullets. We cut their tax rate from 50% to 28%, people. That's a pretty good cut, isn't it? Not only did we do that, but we expanded the tax base dramatically. Reagan said he wouldn't sign the bill unless it were strictly revenue neutral. If it raised $1 in revenue statically, he wouldn't sign it. If it lost $1, he wouldn't sign it. This was all about the constellation of tax rates. Guess what the vote was on that bill in the Senate? 97-3. Simon, Melchior, and Levin were the only 3 senators to vote against that bill. Let me take you through some of the people who voted for this tax cut on the rich. Mr. Lefty Wefty, Alan Cranston from California. Mr. Death Tax himself, Howard Metzenbaum. You remember when he moved to Florida 6 months before he died? I love you guys. You do entertain me. I mean, you really do. You set up these jokes that I can't stop using. My next-door neighbor on Linwood, who's also a good friend of mine, a guy named Al Gore, voted for it. That tall, pinky guy from New Jersey played basketball for Princeton. What was his name? Bill Bradley? He voted for it. Gee, who else did? Chris, that senator from Connecticut, Chris Dodd, he voted for it. Oh, and the senator from Delaware, what's his name, Joe Biden voted for it. And Teddy Kennedy voted for it. Let me tell you who else voted for it. They were House members who voted for it. Barbara Boxer voted for it. Dick Durbin voted for it as a House member. Oh, a guy from Nevada, a House member named Harry Reid voted for it. Chuck Schumer voted for it as a House member from New York. And Charlie Rangel voted for it, House member from New York. I could go on and on with you. How did you get all those people to do that? Because it's the right thing to do. There is not one politician in Washington today who would run his or her family the way they propose we run our country. Not one. There's not one politician in Washington today who would run his or her family business the way they propose running our country's business. They know they're wrong. And it's just gotten so partisan that once you get a clean sweep in the system, then you'll find the bipartisanship coming back in pro-growth economics.
Question. If a stimulus always sums zero, going back to Jack Kennedy and the race to the moon, did not the government intervention and government spending spawn countless jobs and countless industries to follow?
Yeah. Stimulus spending I'm talking about here, not all spending, because there are roles government plays, and they're very important roles, and I'm not for zero government by any means. Government has to do schools, highways, defense, health care, truth in lending, judicial. I mean, there are just huge numbers of activities. Stimulus spending is the spending above and beyond that to stimulate the economy. The $600 per capita tax rebate, the stimulus in the housing bill, the other. If you look at all the stimulus packages, the nationalization of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the TARP, the $862 billion stimulus package, all those are above and beyond the normal functions of government. Those are the ones that actually hurt the economy. What you want to do is everyone knows all taxes are bad. Some are worse than others. So what you want to do in your fiscal policy is you want to collect your taxes in the least damaging fashion, and you want to spend those resources that you need on the most productive uses of government funds. The total amount of government you want in your society goes to where the last dollar collected in taxes is slightly less painful than the benefits of the last dollar in spending you do. That's the sort of level of where you want to come out on government. But it's the stimulus spending I'm talking about. Now, lest you think stimulus spending wasn't very much. From 2008 through to the present, it's been about $4.5 trillion in the U.S., above and beyond where it normally would have been. To put this into perspective, $4.5 trillion compares to an annual GDP of about $15 trillion. It compares to total federal tax receipts in any one year at about $2.5 trillion, a little less than that on average during this period. So that's what I'm talking about, is stimulus spending. So when I did my one in the OECD countries, I took the 2007 spending as a share of GDP for each of the 34 countries, and then I took the 2009 spending on that, compared it to the 2007. That addition was what I called stimulus spending. You follow me? So that's what I did there on that. But it's stimulus spending that does. Jack Kennedy did a great job. I mean, if you look at Kennedy and his tax cuts and economic growth, I think the moon is a great project. At least I didn't see back then how that was going to be a privately done thing. At least I didn't see any venture capital firms raise. I mean, it's hard to. That's a government project, and I love going to the moon. I love it, and I don't like paying welfare because I'd much rather see a lot of jobs. Now, of course, you pay welfare when you have people who are unemployed and can't take care of themselves, but that should be a temporary program. That should not be a permanent program. It is no substitute for economic growth. It really isn't. I mean, you guys know this more than anything. You've lived it here. Forgive you. I mean, God, it must be awful at times. But have any of you seen? No, but have any of you seen what's happened in the inner cities? The employment rate of minority teenagers. Have you seen it? I don't even say the unemployment rate because it's the employment rate. Most of them have left the labor force and even there. It's a little teeny, it's the worst ever. It's been in place through W and Obama. W is no different than Obama. They're both twins. They're both the two worst presidents ever. You know, and they're competing against each other as to which one. Those kids that have not had a job for 5 or 6 years, they've gotten used to living without jobs and living in that world. How are you ever going to bring them back in? The uneducated. Have you seen the employment rates of the uneducated? Have you seen the unemployment rates of the young? I mean, please, how do you bring these people back into society after being unemployed for 6 years? I mean, my way of thinking, it's a real tough transition. You've got to get that growth going now to bring these people back into the mainstream, to let them be part of the prosperous society we could be. Well,
let's sneak in one more question here.
Dr. Laffer, what a pleasure to be here with you today. I've been following you for years. As you know, most of us here are investment advisors. And I don't know, you'll be able to tell me, is this unprecedented what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing here? And I would really appreciate it if you addressed that piece of what's going on with our economy and the global economy with what's going on in Europe and all of the stimulation in Europe and in the United States, and then holding down the interest rates and not allowing the free markets, and how that's going to impact the economy, and how do we advise the people we invest for?
I got the gist. I was hoping to avoid this topic. It's a full topic. As you know, Ben Bernanke has purchased a lot of debt. He's taken the monetary base of the U.S. from about $840 billion before his first QE1 to where today it's about $2.7 trillion, in that range. All right, that's what he's done with QE1, QE2. He's done that, which, if you take the monetary base, which is bank reserves plus currency in circulation, currency in circulation is approximately $800 billion when he began. So you had $800 billion currency, then you had $40 billion in bank reserves. Today you maybe have $1 trillion in currency in circulation, and you have 1.6 trillion in bank reserves. He's expanded bank reserves some 40-plus fold. This is the largest increase in the monetary base in the history of the U.S. from colonial times to the present times 30. I mean, you're so far out of anything experiential based that we've ever had. Not only has he done the quantitative easings 1 and 2 and now 3 with $40 billion a month in mortgages he's planning on buying, but he also did Operation Twist, was from my professor, who developed that in the 1960s at Yale. A guy named James Tobin did that. What they do is they sell all their short-term securities off and buy only long-term securities. So the Fed owns a hugely disproportionate share of long-term securities. You follow me? Now, let me just say that today the 10-year bond yield is maybe 1.65, 1.7, in that range. If it were to go up to, let's say, 8%, and you mark the balance sheet of the Fed to market. In other words, when interest rates go up, long-term bonds fall in value. You would have a fall in the value of the Fed's balance sheet by something approximating $1 trillion if you marked it to market. Under any circumstance, that's an insolvency of the Fed. That would be a deficiency there of $1 trillion. I'm told by the Fed officials that doesn't matter. They've got different accounting than the rest of us do. That's what the Greek officials told me 2 years ago. Just teasing you. But it is. That's the problem I'm worried about. You can't unwind this one. I've been thinking about this problem very seriously, and I'm not joking on this now, about how, if we took over and if you got control of the Fed quickly, how would you do it? What I would do is, if I were head of the Fed and had all power there, I'd go to the Treasury. I'd swap all the long-term securities with the Treasury for bills, all Treasury bills. I'd take them laddered from 0 to 2 years in maturity and give all the long-term debt back to the Treasury. What I would do is I'd desensitize the Fed's balance sheet to interest rate changes. I would then take all those bills which the Fed would own and distribute them back pro rata to the member banks, who are the owners of the Fed. As you know, they're the depositors there who will be the ones that will lose. And do that until you bring bank reserves back down to the level of required reserves. And then go back to the monetary thing. I don't know what's going to happen on that, but it is something that does keep me up at night. as to exactly how they ever unwind this, and if interest rates ever start going, what do you do with the Fed's balance sheet? That is a really serious question, and I chose deliberately not to answer that question and talk about it because it's such a difficult topic, and I can't even make jokes about it. I'm crying.
Well, once again, thank you, Dr. Laffer. Great job. And I wanted to invite everyone here to the next CABE Luncheon, which is going to be November 8th. It's Dr. Joseph Halbrook from the Cleveland Federal Reserve. He'll discuss economic recoveries post-financial crises. So we are adjourned, and thank you.